All right, so the last concept that I want to discuss is a subset of natural selection. So natural selection, you remember, is heritable change through time based on an organism's ability to compete for limited resources. So one of the resources that we might think of as limited is sexual reproductive partners, right? And so in some ways, organisms compete for access to reproductive partners. And we call this particular form of natural selection, we call that sexual selection. So it's a very specific subset, and it's all about competing for mates. Sexual selection essentially favors traits that facilitate reproduction. And so we'll talk all about the kinds of traits that help organisms be more successful at mating. Let's go. So I suspect that you are full, brimming, maybe overflowing with extra terms to know in this chapter, but here are a few more. We've been talking about sexual selection, and essentially, just to be really specific in its definition, sexual selection is essentially a subset of natural selection that is targeted towards sex-specific traits related to reproduction. We may, in organisms, identify primary sexual characteristics, and those are traits related specifically to fertilization, whereas secondary sexual characteristics are traits related to differences between the sexes in terms of body size, ornamentation, like feather color, their color, or even the shape of their feathers, and courtship. We'll talk all about that here in this lecture. All right, so here's an example of differences in size that are based on the sex of the organism. So you can see the female on the left and the male on the right. In deep sea anglerfish, I don't know if you've heard about this, but males are permanently attached to the female and gain nutrients from the female, just like an ectoparasite would. So we regularly see major differences in female and male size, although it varies depending on the taxa as to who is the larger organism. We also see ornamentation that allows males, those organisms that can mate with many females because they invest very little in parental care, males that have ornamentation that helps them compete for females. And so often these are considered male weapons. Here are some great examples with antlers, but there are many in the animal world that show these competitive structures that help them win access to mates. Here's another example of another sort of form of ornamentation that doesn't help with competition. In fact, it makes it more challenging for an organism to compete. So this is a widow bird, and widow birds, I don't know if you can see their body, it's kind of a small size, but it's basically this long. And then widow birds actually have tails that are ridiculously long. There is no reason why this widow bird needs a tail this long. So researchers said, hey, why on earth is this bird got tails this long? So they went out and they caught a bunch of widow birds and they did some kind of ridiculous things to these birds. In the first case, so they cut everyone's tail off, not so it hurt them, but they just removed the tail. And then what they did was they literally glued the tail back on. In some cases, they shortened the tail. So they cut off a chunk and then they glued on the lower part. So they still had the ends of, it looked like a normal widow bird, but the widow bird had a shortened tail. In other cases, they just glued on the entire tail back on so that it was a control tail. The bird had experienced the gluing, so if anybody hated the gluing look, then it would be noticed, but they glued it back on. And then finally, in some cases, they took this extra length and they made the tail even longer. So they went approximately the same length, yeah, and they created longer tails. And what was fascinating was, I have to mention this, all of the organisms with these crazy long tails are males. And what they found was that males with outrageously long tails had so many more attracted suitors than organisms with control tails or with shortened tails. If you had a longer tail, you were more likely to get a mate. So what this showed was that females were being choosy in the long-tailed widowbird. They were actively choosing who their mate was, and the way they chose was based on the length of the tail that he carried around. And what this leads into is this idea of maybe the tail was an advertisement that told us, well, told those female widowbirds that males with really long tails are capable of growing a long tail. That means they must be very healthy and fit and well nourished, but also that they're capable of evading predation. So if they're capable of evading predation with that ginormous tail, they must be super great. The last thing that's kind of interesting, so with that, there's this good genes hypothesis. And this good genes hypothesis is a hypothesis that individuals choose a mate that possesses a superior genotype. And of course, a subset of that might be the superior genotype reflects good health, right? So we're trying to choose the healthiest mates, which might be associated with your genotype because, I don't know, you're very strong, you're very good at avoiding predation, you're good at avoiding parasitism, you're good at finding food. All of these could make you very healthy. And so, for instance, here's an example with frogs. Well, yeah, frogs. This is a gray tree frog tadpole. And what these tadpoles did was they behaved differently based on whether there was a predator present or absent. Whoops, sorry, absence over on the left, presence on the right. And what you can see is that when there was no predator around, everybody fed, right? And when there was a predator present, nobody fed. But what's interesting is that when there was no predator present, some individuals spent longer feeding than other individuals. And these individuals were differentiated based on what they do when they are adults. Specifically, when you have a long call as an adult, so when you're a gray tree frog and you're croaking your heart out to attract a mate, you have done so after having spent more time eating. You have spent more time nourishing your body and therefore can afford the energy associated with a long call. Because I don't know about you if you've ever tried to replicate what a frog sounds like, but I would suggest you try, and it's difficult to make it last long. But they have to use a huge amount of energy to create that vibrations, those noises, to trap the air and to then echo it, to create a really big echo chamber in their, their skin, their tympanum. Well, not the tympanum, that's their ear, but in their skin, in their throat, right? In contrast, individuals that ate less or spent less time foraging when there was no predator present produced a short call. And this becomes this honest signal by males to suggest, hey, if I have a long call, I'm really good at finding food when there's no predator present. Whereas a short call says, I kind of suck at finding food. I'm not great at finding food when there's no predator present. So what's interesting is that this isn't quite true for the widowbirds. The widowbirds probably started that way, where they had this honest signal that showed good health with slightly longer tails. But the length of the tail that a widowbird has now is representative of what we call runaway sexual selection. Now, females are not choosing the male based on the idea that the tail means he can get away from predators faster. Runaway selection, sexual selection, is when females choose a mate based on a trait that other females will choose. So they're selecting for preference of a sexual trait, and the selection for that trait continues to reinforce each other. So a mother will choose a father based on what she thinks her sons will look like, because she knows that her sons will have more success mating if they have a father with an extremely long tail. So this can be called runaway sexual selection. You will also see it called the sexy sons hypothesis. Now, with that idea of that tail acts as a form of a handicap, right? It makes it difficult for the organism to live its life. And here's another example where we see the handicap principle in action. This is a principle that the greater the handicap an individual carries, the greater its ability to offset that handicap. Now, the widow bird has the handicap of that extremely long tail that it has to fly with, that's going to be energetically difficult to just exist with, never mind avoid predation. But here's another example where we're showing the effect of mites on some very sad pigeons. They all have the same number of mites, and some individuals have relatively good health, and some individuals look really rather distressed indeed. And so with that, I'm done this module. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you about this if you have any questions.